Welcome to this cold and dark start tutorial for the new PMDG 737 for MSFS. First I'm going to show how to get the plane into a cold and dark state. From a normal gate start, head down to the FMC, go into PMDG setup, startup state, cold and dark, then press exec. If you now restart your flight, your plane will be cold and dark. We've now started a new flight with our plane in the cold and dark configuration. As with any cold and dark start, we begin on the overhead panel. We'll start by switching the batteries on, and now the standby power over to battery. In the FMC we can call up our ground power cart from Flight Sim Actions, Ground Services and request ground power. You'll see the ground power cart connect and ground power will become available. Returning to the overhead panel, flick the ground power switch to on, and while we're here we will switch on the window heat on left and right side. We will now align the IRS, so we'll go up top and flick both IRS dials over to nav and they will start to align. On the FMC we'll work our way back to the actual FMC menu. We'll go to position initialize and we'll grab our GPS position and put that in as our starting position for the IRS. Once that's done, the IRS pretty much auto-align themselves. It's at this point during a regular flight that you'd enter your route into the FMC and do all the setup that I did in my full flight tutorial. It's now time to start the APU, so we'll switch on the left fuel pumps and we'll start the APU by flicking the switch all the way down and holding it till it pops back up. After some time the APU will become available. This is indicated by a blue light above the APU generator switches. Of course we'll now switch on the left and right APU generators. The click spots can be a little bit fiddly depending on your camera angle. We'll now also head up to the middle right of the panel, switch on the APU bleed. On the FMC we'll go back into Flight Sim Actions and we'll now release the ground power cart. At this stage we'll switch all the fuel pumps on for the right and the centre tanks, assuming you have fuel in your centre tanks. We'll now switch on the remaining hydraulic pumps. And it's now time to start the engines. So we'll switch engine number 2 over to ground on the overhead panel. If we then head down to the pedestal, you will see it starting to come to life. The next step is to introduce fuel. So that is the lever below the throttle with engine 2 start labelled on it. If you flick that switch, engine number 2 will start and we can monitor that on the engine display in the middle of our panel. Once the engine has successfully started, the yellow warning on the panel will extinguish and you'll hear a click. It's now time to repeat the process with engine number 1. So to the overhead panel, engine number 1 to ground, down to the pedestal. You'll see engine number 1 start to come to life, so at that point we can use the lever below the throttle to introduce fuel and start engine number 1. Again, monitor that startup on the engine panel in the middle of the displays here. With a good start on engine number 1, you see the yellow warning extinguish and there's only a few more bits to tidy up before we can get on our way. We can now switch on the left and right engine generators and just make sure those APU generators are off. Our next job is to switch off the APU bleed and now switch the left and right packs over to auto. We can now switch the APU off completely. Last few bits to tidy up, switch on the yaw damper, arm those emergency exit lights and pop the cover closed. Set the parking brake because we're just about to disconnect the wheel chocks. Switch on lights as required for taxi and takeoff. Stuff like the logo, anti-collision, position lights. Last step, just clearing out any warnings on the overhead panel. Get the pitot heat on. And if you haven't done it already, now's probably a good time to configure your cabin altitude. You just set that to your cruising altitude. You can now also set up your autopilot for your flight. Back in the flight sim action side of things, go to doors and close the open left door. With engine started and the doors closed, there is one more thing we need to do before we can get on our way. And that is to remove the wheel chocks, which also removes the air stairs. And there we go. We are ready to start our flight. That is the end of the cold and dark engine start tutorial for the PMDG 737 for MSFS. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like. Feel free to subscribe as I make this kind of content fairly regularly. Take care and I'll see you next time.